Greeting, dear friends. Welcome to the discussion Indian Union Budget 2021. Is it a path breaker or a dampener? We have with us Sri Sudarshan ji, with whom we will be trying to understand and discuss about the same. Sri Sudarshan Case has over 25 years of varied corporate expertise, of which the last 13 years as CEO, COO, CFO. Sudarshanaji is a BE in mechanical engineering from University of Mysore, postgraduate in nuclear sciences and engineering from prestigious BARC Training School, Trombay, and MBA Finance from the Narsi Monji Institute of Management Studies, Mumbai. A hearty welcome to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity.
Before proceeding further, let us have a quick overview of inflows and outflows. So,
Yes.
for every 100 rupees that comes in, 3 rupees comes from customs, and borrowings and other liabilities, we get 36 rupees.
Very
GST
true.
contributes 15 rupees, income tax 14 rupees, corporate tax 13 rupees, even an exercise duty 8 rupees, and non-tax revenue 6 rupees, non-debt capital receipts around 5 rupees. And every 100 rupee that goes out, we pay 20 rupees towards interest payments and 16 rupees towards state share of taxes and duties. Central 14 rupees goes to the central sector schemes, and finance and commission other transport takes 10 rupees, other expenditure 10 rupees, subsidies 8 rupees, and pensions 5 rupees, and defense 8 rupees. So this is how we get a picture of
Very
what
true.
every 100 rupees that comes in or goes out, what happens to that.
True.
So we talk of the infrastructure. So every 100 rupees spent, 12 rupees goes to railway, urban infrastructure 17 rupees, road 18 rupees, and energy 24 rupees, and all the other infrastructure projects around 29 rupees.
Yes.
A government experiences fiscal deficit when it spends more money than it takes in the form of taxes and other revenues, excluding debt, over some time period. This gap between income and spending is subsequently closed by government borrowing, increasing the national debt and disinvestment. An increase in the fiscal deficit, in theory, can boost a sluggish economy by giving more money to people who can then buy and invest more. Long term deficits, however, can be detrimental for economic growth and stability. So, what's your opinion regarding the fiscal deficit projections as depicted in the chart?
See, frankly, from the beginning of this government, which is from 2014 onwards, their stated policy, intent, and action has been to control the fiscal deficit. They had been setting aggressive targets, and until almost 2018-19, they had been meeting those targets, give or take a few basis points. So they were targeting about 3.5% by 2022, as stated by Mr. late Arun Jaitley in one of his budget speeches. And that was probably one of the biggest achievements because they had controlled the spend, and also they were able to grow the taxes and other collections. Sadly, in 2019-20, there were two reasons why the fiscal deficit went up. First was that the tax collections obviously fell down because of the pandemic, lower activities on economic front in the first 2 quarters, and various other factors, including excess spending by the government for both pandemic alleviation as well as the measures which the government took. So that was obvious, and this is not unique to India alone. Almost all the countries in the world have probably bigger, higher fiscal deficit. And the current year, because of the higher capital expenditure planned and no additional taxes in a big way planned, the fiscal deficit is bound to go up. But what is heartening is the government is bold enough to admit, without bothering about the rating and other agencies, to say, yes, we have a higher fiscal deficit. And it's a reality. This is a year of reconstruction, so we are bound to see a higher fiscal deficit despite probably a robust tax growth. That's the reality.
So, when we see TV news channels now,
Yes.
Earlier the term that was used was, the privatization term was rarely used. They used to
Yes.
speak the word disinvestment.
Yes.
So how has the government suddenly become bold and it is talking about privatization instead of calling it as disinvestment?
See, if you really look at the last 30 years, starting from 1991 when the economic reforms started in a big way, 91, 93 was the first phase of real reforms. When the uh, shackles of rules, licenses, etc., were removed more because of compulsion rather than as an intent. But that has continued subsequently. The government under Vajpayee showed the intent of disinvestment. They didn't call it privatization, but there was a clear intent that government has to get out of the businesses it should not be in. For historical reason, government had to be in those businesses because the private enterprises in India were not robust except for a few groups. So there was a need and probably a compulsion in those days to get into those. Today, when government is clearly saying, look, and yesterday the Prime Minister said, Babus are not there to run the government, run the enterprises, which is a true fact. And Babus have failed in running those enterprises. Almost all the public sector enterprises, although they are headed by technocrats, they are finally controlled by the IAS officers. And except for a few which are intrinsically good, like the NPC, Nuclear Power Corporation, or the Nuclear Thermal Power Corporation, and very few others, most of the others have failed. Like, for example, BHL, which used to be one of the best performing Navaratnas, has failed in the last 5-10 years. Probably because of the openness to Chinese import, which hurt their monopoly. So to that extent, the privatization is now not a taboo word. There will be protests by the people saying that, yes, government is doing capitalistic actions. But the fact is, the government cannot keep on holding to assets which are underproductive. It's another matter whether the private sector will increase the productivity in those or be able to turn them around in a big way. But that is the hope with which the government will probably work on. And the fact is, if the government and the taxpayers primarily get the money from those investments, what the private sector does with that is not our problem. Because primarily the value of the assets which are underlying have to be taken, and nobody is going to pump in money without having a ability to turn it around. So to that extent, I think privatization is an accepted norm today. We should accept it. We should move on.
What is your opinion regarding privatization of LIC of India?
See, frankly speaking, amongst all the insurance companies, life insurance companies, LIC is still the best. None of the private sectors is anywhere near in terms of their risk management, asset management, or settlement also. That's the reality. But if you look at the history of banks and insurance companies in India, most of them were private. They were not government when you got independence. Like Central Bank was private sector, which was backed by Tata's. HAL was started by the private sector. It was not government. It was started by Walchand Nagar Industries. If you look at general insurance, some of the general insurance companies were started by the Tatas. So they were originally private. Some of the banks which were privatized, which are planned to be privatized, were all private banks. Over a period of time, they had probably been nationalized and then got into error because of political interference. The hope is that when we privatize these public sector units, the political interference would reduce. And what would probably come to the fore is only managerial expertise and the failure of managerial expertise, as we have seen in some of the private sector banks. It's not that private sector is not prone to failure. Private sector is equally prone to failures. Take the case of Essar Steel, take the case of Bhushan Steel, take the case of, let's say, banks like ICICI, where we had a scam, or we had Global Trust Bank. There have been failures in the private sector too. But the hope is that once the private sector pushes in a lot of money, like what has happened with NCLT takeover of Essar Steel or Essar Oil or Bhushan Steels, the new buyer will put in all the efforts to turn it around. That is a hope. And LIC definitely will continue to be. LIC would not be privatized. The mammoth size of LIC would not make anybody in the world to buy it. So probably the government would only divest it, have liquidity in the form of shares which it can sell in the market whenever it wants some money. But it would be dominantly a government company in the garb of a listed entity. I doubt whether anybody in the private sector altogether have the ability to take over LIC and run it better than what it is today. Impossible. In my view, it's not possible.
Sir, now these were the major projections related to the allocations and
Yes,
expenditure of health
yes,
compared to the previous years. So now,
yes,
due to COVID-19, we have a negative growth, and now we are
yes,
recovering, of course. So, do you
yes.
think that these projections look rational, or are they rational, or what's your take on that, sir?
See, frankly speaking, sir, way back in last February 2020, I had told my friends, MBA friends, that India would see a negative growth on GDP between 8 and 10%. I don't know whether I had shared with you, but we had even a bet with a few of my people. And we are looking at about 9 to 9.5% negative. The positive side is India has been a resilient country. I mean, the kind of probably when people cribbed a lot when we had lockdown, and I recall that you had even put up the first call with us, with Ashwini and other people, where we had discussed a few of these things.
Yes, yes.
My call has always been that post Dasara there will be a recovery, and post Diwali there will be a robust growth. We are yet to see a consistent, let's say, 200% growth. But what has happened is people have begun to live the life. The key thing for any consumption is people have to start socializing, people have to start leading their social life. That's when they get the confidence that they need to spend. Otherwise, once they're cocooned, it's very difficult for them to spend the money. Now, what has happened is if you look at any of the markets, be it on the offline or online, there is a huge consumption happening. It is not pent up demand, which was not satisfied until September. It is a real demand which is happening. If you look at any of the passenger cars, you can't get any passenger cars unless you wait for 6 months now. It is more driven because of public transport being shunned by the people because they're afraid still to take it. Second, they want to have mobility on their own. So there's a huge demand for auto sector, and auto sector drives various other sectors also. The key driver is the consumption on the retail side, the consumption on the automobile side. The only sector which is yet to kick in a big way is the construction on the residential or commercial properties. That probably will lag by another 6 months. I don't think we will see any major recovery in real estate until about next July or so. That is coming July, August. That's when probably some activity would pick up, and that should really drive the GDP growth for the next 2 years in double digits. That I'm very certain.
Other day there was a speech by Bajaj
Yes,
CEO, and he was telling that his two-wheeler exports have gone up to Europe because of this pandemic. Actually, people have reduced going in the public transport, and they are just trying to switch over to two-wheelers there. Some of them.
it's actually good to hear from him because he was the first person to protest the lockdown.
Yeah.
So it is good.
And
Actually, it's happening. In fact, I was speaking to one of my laptop suppliers. He says he doesn't have time to even call on people because he says his service activity has doubled in the last 1 year. So even to get a mason and electrician today, he's taking double the time he used to take 1 year ago.
okay.
It's not just in Bangalore, it's happening even in Mumbai, it's happening in Chennai. So most of the service related people are back into business in a big way now. Maybe all the last 10 months whosoever didn't get repaired, they're getting it repaired, or they're open to now having people coming home or office. So I think the next 2 years will be a real growth phase, Dr. Shetty, irrespective of whatever happens now. The
So
key thing is life is back. Life is back in India, unlike Europe, unlike US, unlike probably some parts of, let's say, Africa. I can see full activity in India. Maybe it's resilience, maybe it is that virus has mutated, we don't know. But I think life is back to normal. That's a positive side.
yes, I remember we discussing over telephone, telling that
Yes,
India will bounce back, and I think they will
yes,
forget.
yes. They'll forget, yes.
So then, if you see the spending on the proposed spending on health, there is a
Yes,
considerable increase, but
very
major
true.
part of it will still go for the COVID vaccine and
Yes.
vaccination. But do you think that have we learned enough that we are even now we are pumping less money towards health? Do you think it is sufficient,
See,
considering?
the problem with health like agriculture is it's actually a more of a state subject with very little of infrastructure development in the states except AIMS or Atal rural hospitality, rural healthcare, where in each taluk or each district we have one central government funded hospitals, which are running much better than any of the state government hospitals, or even better than private. Uh, the key issue is there is a capital outlay earmarked for primarily healthcare. Uh, I would have expected at least 1 lakh crores for only the healthcare capital expenditure. That's probably where the government is probably a little complacent, or they don't want to take a chance, it looks like, because they don't want to tread into the state arena, especially when the farm issue is already burning. That's my feel. Ideally, they should have set up a public sector, I mean, PPP model, or a state central government kind of a just primary healthcare center in each area. Or the other could be that the success of COVID control in the last 10 months and the way the uh, identification treatment has been done, they have a feel that the infrastructure currently is good enough to take care of any other pandemic of this side. That could be another reason. But I would have expected definitely a PHC in each village as the vision to really be prepared for any of this. That could have been used as a school in the other periods. In the event of a pandemic, the same could have been converted into a hospital. I would have actually expected that.
So then one more major thing that came up, the tax on fuel, they shifted from customs to the cess side, just an internal adjustment where they could allocate it exclusively for the agriculture infrastructure. So what made them to do that adjustment? Is it because from the customer they have to give a share to the states?
Yes.
Or what was the actual reason behind it?
See, I think I just need to step back a little bit here. One of the key features of this budget has been bringing the mojo or the sanity to the budget. For the last 15-20 years, some of the budget has been only a direct taxes rate or a customs duty rate document.
So voice, you are frozen, sir.
In the budget this time has been that there's been hardly any reference to any tax rate, be it direct or indirect. Obviously, with the GST, indirect tax rate is not there at all, except for customs and duty. Coming to excise per se, you are right. The reason it has been taken out is to probably have the whole pool of 2.5% or 2.5 rupees per liter and 3.5 rupees per liter available with the central government to address the agri-infrastructure requirement. Otherwise, any other duty except cess, you will have to share with the states. And since the finance minister said that it won't be an additional burden, obviously it's going to be only available at the center without hurting the customers. That's the feel. But of course, yes, fuel prices are at the highest for a long time compared to any other 2-3 decades.
No, because always BJP, when in opposition, it was vocal about the fuel prices. But now the same government is, doing what the other parties had done. Or maybe the prices are much higher. What is the compulsion behind this, actually?
I think frankly speaking, one of the two rationale. One is, it's the only way everybody who is not a taxpayer pays the tax. See, any direct taxes or GST, unless you are a consumer in a big way, like let's say for direct taxes, unless you are a real income tax assessee, you won't make the payment of income tax. There is a loophole. If you look at GST, except for some items, you don't make the GST payment. Again, it is shared with the state, obviously. One of the rationale for increasing the taxes on petrol was, yes, it's not a essential commodity in the true sense like food or milk or other issues. And people will get used to using it. And the people who can spend 3,000 rupees a month of petrol or diesel can afford to pay another 500 rupees. That's a stretch primarily, like in the corporate. And last year, they probably did it because the other taxes were drastically down in terms of estimates compared to what they had originally estimated. So this was only to plug the gap that they have done it. And if you really look at it, the mopping up has been significant from October onwards. Because till September, the fuel prices were fairly okay. We didn't feel the pinch. Only when post-September, they increased the duties by 10 rupees, is when it started to hit. The fuel companies did not pass on that initial increase until almost September, October, if I am not wrong. It's only post-October they started passing it on. I hope that probably in about 5 to 6 months they would correct it. That's a hope. There is a lot of furor happening in public about the fuel prices.
Uh, I think even they have to consider this because three state elections are coming up, and
Yes,
I think immediately just before elections there is a chance that the prices.
possibly yes. I think if the tax collections in March and April are very robust, probably by April, May, they would start reducing the additional taxes on the fuel, or because the fuel price, crude prices are holding. So there's no hope on the crude coming down, giving us a relief. Crude is only hardening, it's not coming down at all. So the only relief we can expect is by the central government reducing the duties, which hopefully should happen now.
Now, coming to the infrastructure, we saw
Yes.
considerable amount has been allocated. Now,
Yes.
one of the most high-performing ministers is
Yes.
uh,
Gadkari.
Gadkari ji, and
Yes.
even in pandemic, they have done considerably well.
Very true.
And I think this will bring in more, employment opportunities also.
Yes.
So, what's your take on this, sir? What do you say now? How will it help now further?
See, primarily as far as the road construction is concerned, it has been steadily increasing year on year. If you look at the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a steady growth in the national highway projects, both in terms of the number of kilometers as well as the overall expenditure on that. The second thing is with the FASTag giving them a better visibility of the actual revenues, which is there's no pilferage, they are in a better position to now commit higher expenditure than they were 2 years ago. That's a reality. Because at least 99% of all the loopholes have been plugged with the FASTag. They are able to get that because otherwise the toll operator was siphoning off at least 20-30% of the toll revenues. That's a reality. One of the reasons for FASTag was that primarily. Although in the process, they also got about 2 to 3,000 crores of our unused deposits with them and the minimum balance money. So the road, probably next 4 to 5 years, the road construction will continue to grow in this space. Connectivity is something which probably India governments have always focused on, be it the quadrilateral, golden quadrilateral, which Vajpayee introduced, or this current government. I think infrastructure is something which they are very committed to. I think this would continue. Maybe instead of the government capital expenditure, they would go through the NHA and other public sectors to raise the money, which is where we are not feeling the real pinch in a big way with the budget.
They have also brought in a new scheme of bonds so that I think they can aid such projects.
Yes, bonds is there, and also if you look at it in perspective of RBI relaxing retail to buy G-Secs directly, it would make sure that most of the money which is otherwise put in FD may flow into G-Secs also. So in addition to post office savings, government is trying to tap the retail investors like you and me through the G-Sec route, which is giving a decent return.
So they say that there's a new type of bond that they brought in, which are interest-free bonds. But they would give you the returns if the project bring in the returns. Some sort of a new sort of
Yeah, but that would be more like a high yield bond. It's a zero coupon bond with a high yield.
bond. Yeah.
Yeah. It would probably attract only institutional investors. It won't attract the retail investors. It would be probably only risk funds and let's say the hedge funds, which would probably invest in that. No retail investor would invest unless he has an annuity or a annual kind of an income. That would be very difficult. Maybe high net worth individual, somebody may take a risk like equity investment, but I doubt whether it will attract any major real retail investors at all.
Now coming to our
Yes.
about the MSP,
Yes.
even year on year the MSP is going high, and I think Prime Minister also once again promised, telling that the MSPs won't go away.
Yes.
My basic question is, sir, see, why are they not including a clause about MSP in the law? What might be the reason?
See, there are two issues. One is primarily a domestic issue, which is Indian, where even after central government announcing an MSP, the state governments have to declare an MSP on their own, which will be either same or higher than what the central government declares. So the central MSP applies to all the purchases by the FCA or their association organization. States announce it, like for sugarcane and others, where central MSP doesn't come into picture. Like for example, FCA doesn't buy sugarcane directly, but still the state announces MSP. So even if center makes it a law, each state has to pass it as a law for it to be enacted. Central alone making doesn't make a difference, because FCA doesn't account for more than probably 30% of all the MSP purchases. States also buy. Now the second thing is, key issue is, once it is made into a law, to remove that is very difficult in future. That's one reason why political parties are hesitant to do it. Even if you look at opposition, they are not demanding that it be made into law. They're only saying provide a legal provision. There is another key issue which probably most of the people are overlooking is the Uruguay round of World Trade Organization. Way back in 1991-93, under the then Congress government, India was a key participant of the Uruguay round of agriculture. Okay. In 1996-97, when the National Front government was, or United Front government was in power, India became a signatory to the agreement on agriculture by the WTO, which the other day even our journalist friend overlooked it. Okay. Now the issue is, under that agreement, which India is a key signatory, all the governments which are signatories have promised and committed, varied timelines are given, 6 years to European Union or developed countries, 10 to developing countries, 14 to other countries, that no guaranteed price should be announced by the government except for food security issues. So once you have signed an international agreement, it becomes difficult for you to annul it through another agreement. This is primarily going back on that commitment. That's why all the export incentives are also now not existent if you look at it. Earlier, there used to be an export incentive for sugar. There used to be an export incentive for rice. All those have to be removed as per that particular act. There are 2-3 schemes which are there. One is called a blue scheme, one is called a gray scheme, one is called a green scheme. So India got a longer rope by which it got about 14 years of time. So by 2010 onwards, it is bound by that law. But nobody is willing to say that because it's a Pandora's box. Because like they say in Hindi, "Hawa mein sab nange ho jayenge." Every party, including our Madinamaga Devegowda, will be exposed. This is a reality. The Uruguay round, which is binding, because the moment you do that, everybody will pull you into the WTO dispute. This is the reality. So these are two issues. Domestic, legally, because it's a concurrent list or a shared subject dominantly. Central passing that law has no meaning because not all items get procured through the MSP route directly by the government agencies. Like if you're a sugarcane grower, you supply to any sugar factory, they are bound by the MSP. But government is not committing the MSP. I mean, it's not paying you the MSP. They are only saying you buy at this rate or higher than that, and they have to buy. And then there'll be a demand. They will say, look, why only rice and wheat? Why not include ragi? Why not include copra? So it becomes humanly impossible to include all the 150 grains or the food products and say, okay, only for this I provide MSP guarantee. Tomorrow, Areca growers will say, you give me an MSP. Tomorrow, coffee growers will say, give me an MSP. Tea growers will say, give me MSP. Today, copra, they have announced the MSP, but it's not legal. I mean, it's not legally enacted, but it's a MSP which is announced by the central government. Recently, they hiked it about 3 weeks ago. Mr. Javadekar announced it, that copra has been increased. Like jowar growers. So the issue here is a legal bind which the union is bound by, because of which it's impossible. Because the Uruguay round, if you read the agreement, it clearly says, except for food security purposes, no support price should be announced by any government anywhere in the world.
Sir, now, if you see, they have introduced some sort of duties on some import of some pulses and some vegetables.
Yes.
Doesn't this Uruguay that agreement come into picture here when they prevent?
No, it doesn't come, because Uruguay round doesn't say that you should not levy a duty. It will come under the broad guidelines of the WTO. That are you creating a barrier? In this case, what has happened is when it is a anti-dumping duty is permissible even under the WTO. So here, if you heard the finance minister's speech, both on steel and a few other products, she specifically used the word anti-dumping to prevent dumping. And if you look at it, there's only one country to which it is targeted, which is China. Everything which is a duty increase has been targeted at China. If you look at everything, specifically, it has not been mentioned, but you can make out that although she clarified that that's not necessarily the intent. She didn't say it is not the fact, but she says not necessarily is what her comment was in one of the TV18 interviews. The fact is, all those products where the duty increases happen, be it like TV panels, be it like automobile components, be it agriculture related, they are all targeting only China because if you look at the ASEAN countries, they are covered under the ASEAN treaty with India, where they have a free duty or a concessional duty. So this won't be applicable to them.
Okay. Okay.
So
So this is China specific.
this is dominantly China specific in my view. I mean, it is done in a very smart way because if they were to do it through an order, China could have probably objected saying that you are targeting us. In this case, dumping is used, so it's the onus is on the other party that they are not dumping to show that they are not dumping. But it's a smart move. I think it's a very, very because I feel painful when I go to a Hopcoms or a Metro shop to see imported apples selling at 300 rupees, whereas Indian Shimla apples are selling at 140 rupees. Why should I buy imported apples at 300 when I have Indian apples which are equally good quality? I think we should promote our product.
Yes. I think that has to come in.
Yes, because it took 7 decades for us to get our mangoes exported to US. So I think we should not hesitate to ban the other agriculture products from other countries.
Now, sir, this coming to the question of faceless assessment. So she has said that a national faceless income tax appellate tribunal center would be established.
Yes.
All the communication between tribunal and appellant shall be,
yes.
Electronic. So whenever personal hearing is needed, it should be done through video conferencing. So what's your opinion? I think this has already started now. I think the announcement came.
See, this is actually a pet project of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I remember Modi ji telling, if corruption has to come down, the human interference has to go down.
Yeah. See, frankly speaking, it is his pet project for the last 2015 onwards. It's his pet project. He almost took 3 years to push the income tax officers to accept it. And if you look at the history, it started with e-proceedings. When you logged into your IT portal, you had something called e-proceedings. In the first year, they gave an option saying that, do you want to do e-proceedings or manual? Then he found out that the income tax officer were forcing the assessee to opt out of e-proceedings. So subsequent to 1670, it was made compulsory the e-proceedings. Okay. Then the faceless assessment was started. There was a huge opposition by the income tax officers. As of last year, despite the pandemic, he forced them to do the entire sample requirement assessment through faceless only, which was about 70,000 assessments had to be done faceless. He said, we don't care, you have to do it. It showed that it was possible, that faceless assessment is possible. And this is an extension saying that if we could do faceless here, why not do appeals also faceless? Because there's no major change. The same document is same inflation before. The whole thing is to bring let's say, some kind of a transparency, reduce corruption, and probably to assure the assessee that, you have to relax. Because if you look at it earlier, your income tax forms used to have a circle or the ACIT detail. About 3 years ago, for those drawing less than 10 lakhs, it was not required because it was not even asking for it. From last year, even for you and me, it doesn't ask which circle you belong to. So it's a good step in the good direction, although there is a huge resistance happening in the IT department. Although there is a huge confusion prevailing in the IT department. If you look at 90% of the staff in IT department now are allocated and redesignated as faceless assessment related people.
Okay.
Except investigation part and some of the, let's say, specialized cells, most of the others are reallocated as faceless assessment. So if you look at, you had an assistant commissioner of income tax in Udupi, he is no more assistant commissioner of income tax Udupi. He is assistant commissioner faceless for that blocked. That's all.
So it's almost losing. He has lost his identity, faceless.
He has lost his income, I would say.
And moreover, if the video conferencing comes in, even the inquiry would be recorded, and it will be very
Yes, everything would be recorded. There is a electronic digital trail happening. And pre-filled tax returns, it's a very good question. See, currently, Dr. Shetty, you must be knowing, every one of us, including you and me, we are monitored on 120 parameters for the last 5 years, not today. 120 parameters, which starts from your credit card processing, whatever expenses you incur, high value purchases, mutual fund transactions, shares transaction. Supposing I and you exchange, let's say 5 lakhs as a temporary loan, that also gets reported automatically on a daily basis to income tax. So there is already a metadata system prevailing. There is a AI already working. In each bank, there is a AML, that is anti-money laundering cell in each bank, in each region. Let's say you take State Bank of India. For Bangalore, there will be AML cell, anti-money laundering cell. So supposing if your normal transactions, let's say in a year, 15 lakhs is the maximum. Supposing you get 1 crore of rupees in your account, the AML cell will send a information and a query to the concerned bank manager saying investigate and report. That report has to go back to Reserve Bank of India and Income Tax Department parallel. It's happening. So it's very difficult to escape any transaction. The pre-filled is a step to say, look, like if you look at Form 26A, which came in 2009, prior to that, many of the TDS reconciliations were not happening. So your TDS Form 16 was the basis to claim TDS. Subsequent to 26A, only what was matched there was what is available to you. So even if somebody says, I have deducted TDS on you, you won't be eligible to claim that. So pre-filled is only to tell the people, look, two things are there. One is easing your work, so you don't have to fill up the data. Second, like Form 26 years, you know what is the income, what is the tax. And to send a subtle message, you are being watched 24 hours.
I think now the privacy crusaders will come into picture, and they're telling that government will be watching you.
Very true. See, any transaction you do, supposing earlier the limit was if you have a property transaction above 30 lakhs, it has to get reported. Post demonetization, even above 5 lakhs will get reported. So anybody who does with a PAN number, it gets automatically reported. So there's a huge software which is working, which compares your transaction with your previous annual returns for, let's say, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, sees whether you're within that range. Otherwise, you'll be sent a notice, which is a good sign.
And if we compare the same thing with many of the developing countries, I think they don't have this system. I think we are much ahead than most of the developing or developed countries.
Very true. Even US would not have this kind of a system, nor Singapore has. We probably are one of the few countries where such a level of data, I wouldn't call it surveillance, data acquisition is happening.
Yeah. Multiple points, the data is captured, and I think
yes,
collated, and things.
They're comparing. Yes.
Now, what about this one-person company for NRIs? Earlier the NRIs were not allowed to form the OPCs. Only resident individuals were allowed. Now, what's the reason behind this particular amendment? Why is it?
In my view, there are two aspects. One is to tell the NRIs that, look, you are on par with the domestic people, so you can form. And it's a prevalent, let's say, process anywhere in the world, be it in the US, like in Delaware company, you can have a single person company, or in Singapore, you can have a single person company. So it's only to bring parity there. The second thing is there used to be a lot of benamis happening. So there is a US guy who gets a local guy involved as a second shareholder. There would be some kind of a tacit understanding. So government was suspecting that the money was going from here overseas, coming back through the NRIs, and he was only a front end, and this guy was the real operator. So that would get negated to a great extent. So beyond that, I don't think there is much of a issue here. It's only to ease the business and also to make sure that the, let's say, circuitous route of money going out and coming back to somebody and having a face of somebody outside of India will be there. That would not continue at all.
So next question is about extension of the tax holiday for the startups by
Yes.
1 year, whose turnover doesn't exceed around more than 25 crores in a
Yes.
financial year. So do you think actually there is an impact on these startups, and how is the startup space working actually? Do you think that the actual benefit, it's people are taking that actual benefit?
Primarily, if you look at the most of the startups, they will take 3 to 5 years to break even. So any tax holiday in those 3 to 5 years is really not a benefit, except a cosmetic thing. Or there may be some startups, like let's say there is a startup in some IT area where they start generating profit from the number year two. They could probably have some benefit in this. Other than that, this would not be a major impact to push the startup ecosystem. I don't think that would really do it. It would primarily do go based on what the idea is, what the market is, what the funding is. This will only be a small facilitator. This will not be a key impetus. I don't think so.
Because many of the startups what I have come across are all
Yes,
related to doing the normal work using the internet as
very true.
a medium. Nothing innovative, maybe in the field of automating agriculture or healthcare.
Yes,
There are things are coming up, but the expected scale I have not been to
I
observe.
agree with you because most of them are not into innovative products at all. They are more into, let's say,
Movement from
shared
brick and
platform
mortar,
or service.
yeah, brick and mortar to the app based
That is true. That's the
aggregate.
only thing happening. Yes, there are very few like Coup, which is probably a good startup.
Yeah, yeah. And who came in the right time. I hope
Came at the right time.
and I think government has to tell that all the ministers and many of the major people to come and subscribe to that so that they
Apparently, they have shifted it since. Most of them are shifting now.
okay, then that's a good
Which,
move because
which is a good.
we have been held ransom by a foreign company and
Yeah, yeah. Twitter cannot act that it is bigger than Indian laws, whatever may be. I mean, if it can actually ban Trump from tweeting, these are much worse than that. Trump was only inciting violence within his country. These are people inciting in another country, which is wrong. Let's hope something comes out of it.
yeah. Now, in order to rationalize tax exemption for income earned by high-income employees, it is proposed to
Yeah.
restrict tax exemption for interest income earned on employees' contribution to various provident funds to annual contribution of 2.5 lakhs.
Yes.
So if I contribute more than 20,800, then for PF, then whatever I receive later on will be taxable. So
Yeah.
what's your opinion, sir? I
See,
think
primarily what
this
used to
was some
happen
sort of a
was,
benefit for maybe some sort of high net worth individuals or high salaried people, but it was some sort of an incentive for people who are taxpayers. So what's your opinion, sir?
see, there are two issues. One is if you look at it, most of us we used that benefit. We did in two ways. One is you were getting two benefits. Supposing you increased your PF from, let's say, which is normal 20,000 rupees, let's say 30,000 rupees, you increased to 60,000 rupees. Two things happened. The additional 30,000 rupees, which was a incremental contribution of employer, which went up to your CTC, never reflected as a taxable income. Good. Because only your contribution came under the Chapter 6A limit. So you got the benefit directly thereafter 30,000. Plus, you are earning a tax-free income on that itself. And if you look at it, PF is still today the highest returns category amongst all the debt. Take any bond or anything, it is still giving the highest one. There is a high pressure there. And government has probably analyzed that bulk of the PF returns are going to high net worth individuals than the lower and the middle levels. So here, because if you look at it, if you have contributed more than 2.5 lakhs anyway, your Chapter 6A benefit is limited only to 1.5, right? Including PF and other things put together, LIC put together. So you are only trying to probably exploit the benefit on the interest. So to that extent, I don't think it will make too much of a difference to the individual. Because supposing, let's say you are contributing 1 lakh rupees more, on that you are getting 8,000 rupees, 8,500 rupees per year as the interest. So you're going to pay the interest, tax on that interest at your average rate, which is a 2,000 rupees. So I don't think it is too much of a burden for people above 20 lakh rupees bracket. But yes, it hurts some people definitely. Yes.
Sir, your opinion on these proposals. So,
The first one doesn't really make much difference because it's only for the people who have only pension and interest income. So supposing if a senior citizen above 75 has a rental income, he still has to file the returns. So it's only for probably a tip of the pyramid kind of a people, not for all. So it's more of a cosmetic change rather than a real change. And time limit, that's I think it's one of the most revolutionary changes in the income tax. It's really revolutionary because from 6 years opening, it has been reduced to 3 years opening. So, which means that the taxpayer can relax freely after 3 years, unless he has 50 lakhs and above to hide. It reduces a huge workload on the tax authorities. And the key constraint here is they have to go to the Chief Commissioner of Income Tax, Principal Commissioner of Income Tax, to open beyond this 3 year limit and convince them why it is so. So it is primarily to give comfort to the taxpayer and reduce the burden of tax authorities big way, because even if 6 years was remaining, how many cases really get opened up? You please tell me. It is more of a provision to harass than CSO making money, income tax officer making money. So I think it's probably the boldest move of this government in the last 6 years. It's a revolution, frankly speaking.
sir, now what's your opinion about Manrega? The allocation has come down. Do you think that Manrega is still relevant?
See, Manrega prima facie, when it was started itself, was a very bad opinion, bad idea. It was probably started post 2009 Lehman crisis just to uh, give some comfort under the vote bank politics, frankly. It destroyed two industries. One is agriculture and construction. Labor was not coming because of Manrega. Even even a person like Deepak Parekh had mentioned this openly then. The second thing is, although the government made a structural change to Manrega, that instead of just giving wages, this has to be a infrastructure related or a capital related expenditure, like digging some rain ponds, digging some water pits, those kind of stuff. Still, I feel it is not required in today's age. It has to go because it is more a corruption tool, despite the direct benefit transfer, in the hands of the panchayat. Because I don't imagine why a labor who has to get 340 rupees minimum wages as per Karnataka will go and work for 200 rupees in Panchayat under Manrega. It beats the logic. So to that extent, it is more of a saying, okay, I have to do the favor to this Panchayat member. Let me allocate this Manrega to him so that some work is done. I would have been happy if this Manrega was allocated, brought down to 20,000 crores a year, but probably they will do it year by year slowly. It's a waste. Frankly, it's a big waste.
Now they have allocated a considerable amount for national education mission. There has been an increase. Now
Yes.
they spoke also of establishment of signing schools in various
Yes.
various locations across states. I think UP government has already given proposals for establishment of signing schools and so on. So what's
Yes,
your
yes.
opinion, sir?
I think it's good that the central aided schools come into the picture in a big way. Because if you compare any Kendriya Vidyalaya, Sainik school or any central done school, they are far, far better in terms of quality of education and the quality of students who come out compared to any of the state-run schools. So to that extent, I think government has to probably spend double this than what it is spending in the central schools, mostly in the rural areas, not in the cities. Because there's no meaning in having a Kendriya Vidyalaya in Bangalore or Mangalore. They need to have a Kendriya Vidyalaya in a rural area. I mean, I hope that shift will come into picture. Of course, Metro Project Bangalore is one of the biggest beneficiaries of those additional money. There is some politics behind it, but also to say that, yes, we want to help the urban infrastructure. That could be the reason.
Now, sir, coming to the question of FDI,
Yes.
so there have been doubts raised, especially by Dr. Subramania Swamy and other
Correct.
economists, that the FDI, that inflow is from the various tax havens, and that's the reason the share market is also going up and other things. So, what's your opinion, sir?
See, there are genuine foreign direct investments. There are also some camouflage direct investments. Of course, the Mauritius has lost its sheen because all those benefits are taken out for the Mauritius route. Uh, Post the Panama Papers, Bermuda and other things are under scan. Any investment coming from Singapore, which is another haven, that's also under scan now. So there is a filtration of money coming in, but one can't hide oneself from the fact that politicians do have a lot of money abroad. They find some vehicles to bring the money in. And the positive side is at least the money is coming back to India in some form or the other. So long as there's no sovereign guarantee, I think we should welcome any money which comes into India, so long as it's not a criminal or a blood money. But it will continue to be there.
Should there be any law so that it cannot be taken back so fast?
See, there are restrictions when the RBI issues the guidelines or FFP issues the approvals. There is a restriction on the repatriation of equity as well as repatriation of dividends and any foreign money which comes into India, except for the stock market related. So unless the company starts really making profits and has enough foreign reserves, they cannot repatriate the equity freely. So there are restrictions already in place.
So recently, there were some allegations regarding SEBI insider trading, and they go for out of the court settlement. And the
Yes.
law is very stringent if you go to US or any other country. Why is the
Very-
out of the court become a common norm in India now?
See, unfortunately, the problem with India has been SEBI has never been very powerful. It is same as earlier CCI we used to have. Unlike SEC, which is very, very strong in the US, not just on insider trading, even on the disclosures which the people make in their annual reports and filings, they're very strict. That's how the Mr. Gupta of McKinsey and that Sri Lankan billionaire, they were all put behind the bars through the uh, SEC investigation route. I know whether you read that book on that scam. It's a beautiful one.
Yes. Yes.
But SEC has been very stringent. They even don't get scared to issue notices to the big four audit firms if they find something amiss. Unfortunately, in India, SEBI neither has the guts nor the wherewithal to deal with this, which is the reality. So since they don't have probably the guts to take on the biggies, be it the Reliance or others, they started a trend of out of court settlement. So once you have started for somebody, it becomes a precedent for everybody, which is the reality. There is a rampant insider trading happening. Like when I was CFO of a listed company, I would never trade in the shares of that company because it was hardcore insider trading, even if I wanted to do. But today you can see many CFOs are even people in the news channels, like any of the finance news channels, like I can't name them obviously. They are all part of the insider trading schemes. Even one of the very well-known anchors who is now no more with that finance channel, he was a big insider trader. Very big, because he would call the CFOs or COOs for the interview. 20 minutes before that, he will say, can we have a dry run? In that 20 minutes, he will extract whatever information was required. So before the market opens, he has already played the market before the interview is out. So those things are getting curbed slowly, but still, I don't think any journalist is being acted upon. Any major, let's say, I would say, entrepreneurs actors. Like for example, yesterday, if you look at Magma Finance, Adar Poonawalla of Serum Institute has bought it. He's made open offer for 60% of the stake. I was surprised that in 3 days, the stock has gone from 55 to 85 by the time the announcement came. So who knew this? If a 60% increase has happened in the stock price and the news has come only yesterday, somebody either who is a legal advisor or a financial advisor, due diligence guy, or the internal company guy has played something there. Actually, SEBI should get all those details, find out who is the guy who is involved, who has bought it, investigate the phone records of those high volume guys, and go after them and send them to jail for a few years. Then only it will change. Otherwise, it's very rampant, actually. Frankly speaking, insider trading is very rampant in India. I mean, sadly, SEBI doesn't do much about it. It only catches a few people like you and me. Supposing we suddenly start trading in high volume, they will send you a notice. How did you do it? Why did you do it? And for our bad luck, if the share price shoots up by 40% after we buy in, we'll be caught. That's the sad part. Ashwin will be the best guy to talk on this, but this is my view.
Actually, he had posted, a couple of names in his Facebook posts.
Yes.
About the people who are involved in insider trading. I didn't bring up the
No,
name.
many people are involved. I mean, big ones. It's not small ones, except probably Tata's to some extent. Most industrial houses are playing in a big way.
So what's your opinion, overall opinion about, Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan?
See, frankly speaking, this is an extension of Make in India. If you look at it, it's a new name. What started as Make in India is now pushing towards Atmanirbhar Bharat. But key thing for that is MSME has to be strengthened. You can't have an Atmanirbhar Bharat without MSME being in place. Like if you look at Taiwan, we need to copy the Taiwan model in total. Taiwan has succeeded mainly because they have supported the micro, small, and the medium enterprises, not just the large ones. The ecosystem of MSME Taiwan is probably the best in the world.
So
You can set up yeah.
So the success of MSMEs will define the success of Atmanirbhar.
In my view, that is the key thing. The government has to support MSME in a big way. Government has to make it as an ecosystem around MSME, while large players will do huge investments. It's like how Maruti developed initially with its own ecosystem of ancillary units. Without them, it's impossible, actually. I mean, if you look at Taiwan, you can go today as an Indian, set up your own small unit in flat 7 days with all registrations complete. And you get a concessional rate of interest of loan. In India, the moment you are MSME, they see you with microscope and say you are a suspect. That's a problem. You want to open a bank account, you have to follow hundreds of procedures. Forget the loan.
And you get a loan if you have sufficient, you don't require a loan.
You don't require a loan. And the problem is, that's what I argue with banks. A large industry like Reliance or even a mid-sized industry gets the loan at, let's say, 8% or 7%. Except for this period of MSME benefits, MSME end up paying 2 to 3% more for the same loan or at 1/10 of the loan, which is the tragedy. That's the whole problem. So unless that improves, primarily in manufacturing. See, if you look at any of the other areas, services, we are fairly okay because of this entrepreneurial culture. I think manufacturing is where the huge push is required. For that, unless there is MSME which supply all the components, no big company can succeed. That's my view, probably.
And even if you see the KSFC and other financing organizations,
Yes.
they're very costlier when compared to even normal banks. Actually,
They're huge.
And subsidies have become a big scam.
It is a big scam, and even to get a loan is a big scam. Even at 14%, which KSFC charges, you need to bribe them. They don't have any project management or project assessment wherewithal at all. That's the whole issue.
Sir, your concluding remarks. Was this budget a path-breaking one, or was it a dampener? Sir.
See, frankly, is it a dampener? No way at all. This is probably the budget which was unexpected, given the track record of the last 2 years of budgets. And given the pandemic, nobody expected government to come with such a bold budget. It probably is one of the boldest budgets of both India 1 and 2. It is reformist in nature, and it's probably a gutsy budget because it has the courage to say we are going to do this, including the 3 years assessment period, which I don't think even Chidambaram or anybody thought of, frankly. Everybody wanted to have the leash on the taxpayer and have that control. This government has probably unleashed it, saying that, look, you are free to do so long as you are an honest taxpayer, which is a good thing. Because what was hanging on not just the dishonest taxpayer, even on honest taxpayer, the sword was hanging for 7 years. Like you had to keep the documents, you have to see where you spent what, how the money came, all that issue was. Second thing is, if the intent of the budget has been phenomenal, the direction is very good. Even if 70 to 80% of what they have shown as a broad picture policy, if they implement, this probably will be a most transformational budget of this century for us so far. But the key is in the implementation. If the finance minister and the prime minister office can push for implementation in a big way, and even if 70% success is achieved, I think the Babus themselves will change their opinion about this government. That's my view. And it will be really, then there's no looking back. Then the next year will probably be much more bolder and much more reformist budget than what we have seen now.
As like we had discussed the other day, and we
Yes.
saw much confident, Miss Sitaraman than
Yes.
previous budgets.
Yes.
She was
Very-
more confident.
Confident, and the team was very, very good. I mean, my feel is probably, I could be wrong. This is a budget which is driven by the PM himself. You could see the intent behind it. And if you look at each of the secretaries who spoke on the TVs, there was a huge conviction in what they were doing. It was not just parroting what was there in the budget. There was a rationale behind it. My only hope is that probably in the next 3 to 6 months, they'll put everything into action so that, markets, individuals, everybody sees that the intent has been really well thought of. That's the hope. I mean, next year could probably skyrocket in all this. We could probably see even a 15% growth next year if we do this year. That's a feel.
I hope our wishes will come true and see a 15% growth. Thank you
Yes.
so much, sir. Thank you.
Thanks
so
a lot,
much
Doctor.
for
Thank you
spending
so
your
much.
valuable time with me, despite your busy
No.
engagement.
No, thanks a
Thank you
lot.
so much, sir.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much.